The ancient Greeks believed in fate. And if you want to know how they thought about it, just read Oedipus Rex. It's a story about a guy who tries to make sure that a prophecy didn't come true. It was foretold that he would kill his father and beget children with his mother. And he was kind of freaked out, so he left home immediately. And in doing so, he fulfilled the prophecy. The moral of the story? You can't change fate. In Greek mythology, the Moirae were responsible for fate. They were three women we call the Fates. Their names were Clotho, Lachesis, and Anthropos. They spun, measured, and cut the thread of life, respectively. You can see how this presents fate as a sequential progression, analogous to the line from birth to death. So for the Greeks, fate was this external force that dictated a fixed and linear path for each person, and even the gods. This conception of fate is a little different than the one we find in the first works of what we call English literature. The Anglo-Saxons settled in England after the fall of Rome, and England stayed Anglo-Saxon until William the Conqueror did his conquering thing in 1066. The Anglo-Saxons lived in small farming communities, and they really valued kinship and loyalty, and they were heavily influenced by warrior culture, so add the heroic ideal to their values. When they weren't fighting other tribes, they hung out in the mead hall. There was mead in the cups, smoke in the rafters, and shields on the walls. And sometimes there'd be a poet chanting a story older than memory. This was a world governed by Wyrd. We translate Wyrd fate, but that's not exactly right. Our word fate is heavy with the connotations passed on to us by the ancient Greeks. You know, it's linear, and there's nothing that you can do to change it. Wyrd isn't exactly like that. It wasn't thought of as a single thread from birth to death. Wyrd was more like a web, or it played out within a complex web. Anything that you did would loosen some strands and tighten others, just a little. So your actions could influence the tensions on the web. And you weren't the only one that was pulling on the web. Other people, past events, things like storms and accidents, oaths, time, spirits, omens. Wyrd had some flex to it. It was a dynamic process, more like a force of becoming. The word itself is derived from the verb to become. So instead of thinking of Wyrd as a linear journey, it might be better to think of it as something unfolding, in the way it inevitably will. It's important to remember that despite the difference between fate and Wyrd, the individual has no control over the unfolding. And that wasn't an excuse to wait for life or death to happen to you. The Anglo-Saxons followed the heroic code, and this demanded bravery, loyalty, and a fighting spirit, even in the face of certain doom. In Beowulf, we find this line, which translates to, "Fate often saves an undoomed man when his courage prevails." That line captures the tension that Western literature has never stopped wrestling with. Fate is real, but courage still matters. You can't escape what's coming, but you still have to stand up to meet it. Then Christianity entered the mead hall. When the Beowulf poet wrote out Beowulf, this Christian monk faced a bit of a theological problem. How do you fit the pagan sense of Wyrd into the Christian worldview? Well, he didn't simply write the idea of Wyrd out of this story, he folded it into the idea of God's providence. If God is in control of all things, he's in control of Wyrd as well. With the arrival of Christianity, the warrior ethos didn't disappear either. It too was enfolded into the Christian worldview. God ordained all things, but the hero still fights. So even if the outcomes of the battles are known to heaven, courage still counts. So there's this tension in Anglo-Saxon society between Christian teachings and the heroic ethos. And this is something that Christianity has carried ever since. Some pagan practices were condemned, like the worshipping of the old stone gods. Other things were accepted and incorporated, like the heroic ideal. We've seen a bit of a resurgence of the heroic ideal in modern evangelicalism, with some people talking about a muscular Christianity. People think it's in the Bible, but really they are drawing on our culture's literary heritage. Look for a link to a video about that in the description. The Beowulf poet was able to keep the concept of Wyrd in his transcription of the Beowulf epic because he didn't have a problem with the paradox that human beings have free will and God is in complete control of everything. He didn't have a problem with it because he had discovered this paradox in the Bible long before he had taken up his quill. Enter the Lady Fortuna. By the time we get to Boethius in the 6th century, fate has a face, and what a fickle face it was. Fortuna has a wheel, and as she spins it, a king is lifted up high and enjoys some glory. But this state of affairs doesn't last forever, because the wheel keeps turning, and the king is brought down to ruin. There are, you can see, 4 figures holding onto the wheel. One is rising, regnabo, it means I shall reign. At the top, regno, that's I reign. And then there's the guy going down, regnavi, I have reigned. And then the guy at the bottom, sum sine regno, I am without a kingdom. So how does Boethius, as a Christian writer who presumably believes that God is in control of all things, explain destiny as a lady spinning a wheel? Who's in charge here? In The Consolation of Philosophy, arguably the most influential book of the Middle Ages, Lady Philosophy tells Boethius that fortune's apparent randomness is actually a part of God's plan. So behind the turning of the wheel, there is providence. Steady, benevolent, unchanging. It's a big shift from Anglo Saxon Wyrd to medieval fortune. Fate moves from being a blind force of nature to a servant of divine will. Fortune becomes God's instrument, and God is benevolent, not just blind and indifferent. He's teaching us that earthly goods are fleeting and only spiritual goods endure. Geoffrey Chaucer translated Boethius into English, and so these threads are running through the Canterbury Tales. In The Knight's Tale, all the reversals and random violence end with Theseus' speech about the first mover of the first cause. So we learn that although fortune looks chaotic, it's framed by ultimate order. It's a worldview of consolation. Yes, terrible things happen, but they happen inside a meaningful pattern. The wheel turns, but a benevolent God holds the axle. But then there's the monk's tale, which is so fatalistic that the knight can't resist interrupting it, because there's so many examples of fortune's cruelty. Where's the loving God? So we are left with some niggling questions in the medieval period. If God ordains everything, what room is there left for human choice? If fortune is just God's tool, why does it feel so random and cruel? With the Reformation, some thinkers had had enough with the tension between God's sovereignty and human free will. It was time for a little certainty. John Calvin reads Augustine and goes all in on divine sovereignty. Everything, absolutely everything, unfolds according to God's decree. Humans act willingly, but not freely in the modern sense. We choose what we want, but what we want is shaped by our fallen will. In essence, Calvin says that God's choice comes first. Before anything we do, before any faith we might have. We don't choose God, God chooses us. Jacobus Arminius pushes against this idea. He insists that the individual plays a role in their own salvation. Grace is necessary, but it's resistible. Election, he says, is based on God's foreknowledge of our free response. In essence, Arminius argues that God's grace opens the door, but we have to walk through it. And that choice is real. So suddenly the Protestant world is split over this burning question. How free is human will? And while this theological war is waging, and real ones, the great authors explore this idea through literature. Shakespeare's characters live right in the middle of the debate. Macbeth hears a prophecy that says that he will be king, but he doesn't simply wait for the fulfillment of this prophecy. He turns the wheel himself. He freely chooses to murder Duncan. So is he fated or free? It looks like the whole thing is inevitable, but every step toward the throne is his own choosing. Hamlet, on the other hand, sees providence in the falling sparrow. He says there's divinity that shapes our ends. But that doesn't stop him from agonizing over every decision. So Shakespeare is dramatizing the tension between sovereignty and freedom. John Milton does more than dramatize. He tries to resolve the tension. In Paradise Lost, God foreknows everything, and humans choose freely, and somehow both are true. Milton insists that the paradox works. Foreknowledge doesn't cause the choice. But the poem strains a bit under the weight of this claim, and that strain is part of its beauty. So far in our story, we have gone from the idea of some form of fate governing our lives to a balance between free will and God's providence. For you advocates of freedom out there, this is pretty much as good as it's going to get. Because in the 19th century, we revert to fatalism again. In 1859, Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species. He didn't set out to dismantle free will, but the mechanism that lies under his theory did just that. Natural selection reframes life as a chain of causes and effects. Organisms inherit traits, environments filter those traits, and what survives is what happens to fit. It didn't take too long for some smart people to figure out the implications of this theory. The human being is shaped by impersonal natural forces, biology interacting with the environment. So choices are just instincts that contribute to survival. Well, there's not too much room for agency. And literature responds. Emile Zola takes Darwin's idea and turns them into a literary philosophy. Humans are products of forces they don't control. Biology, environment, social conditions. So his novels read like case studies in determinism. Characters are less moral agents and more chemical reactions in a social laboratory. But my favorite is Thomas Hardy. In Tess of the Dubervilles, Tess isn't ruined because she's immoral or makes terrible choices. She's crushed by circumstances, by rigid social codes in a universe that feels either cruel or completely indifferent. Her family is so poor that they figured that they better send her to live with some wealthy relatives. But this doesn't go so well. There's a seduction and a betrayal and then judgment, and there's no escape. No matter what Tess does, every move she makes tightens the net around her. Hardy's point is clear. Her tragedy isn't about sin. It's about the brutal collision between human vulnerability and the forces that are beyond her control. But this isn't the old Anglo Saxon Wyrd or any of the other things that we've talked about. It's fatalism without dignity. There's no cosmic meaning, there's no divine axle. It's just blind cause and effect that grinds down human hope. And the sciences of the day, physics, psychology, sociology, they all seem to agree. The Enlightenment ideal of a human being as a rational, autonomous individual is starting to look a lot like a myth. And if you think things are bad with Thomas Hardy, they get worse. Through all these shifts, Christianity keeps holding on to the paradox that God is sovereign and humans are responsible. Both truths stand, neither cancels the other out. Theologians have been working on trying to explain it. Aquinas talked about primary and secondary causes. Molina talked about middle knowledge. More recently, we have the open theists who talk about limiting God's foreknowledge. But the paradox persists. And this should be no surprise. Anything that ends in ology is going to have a hard time with any paradox. Authors seem to deal with the paradox a little more easily than do the theologians. Dostoyevsky doesn't resolve it, he dramatizes it. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov isn't just poor and caught up in a radical ideology. Dostoyevsky takes us into his fevered mind, and we can see him rationalize the murder, and then collapse under the guilt. As we read this novel, we feel the paradox. Ideas and circumstances push him towards the crime. But every one of his tortured monologues reminds us that he is morally responsible for these choices. And that tension pulses through the whole book. George Eliot does the same thing in Middlemarch. Her characters are caught up in the web of Victorian social codes. Marriage expectations, class obligations, gender roles. But for Eliot, it's all about the choices. Yes, Dorothea is caught up with idealism and Lydgate with ambition. And these crash up against reality, but their decisions matter. In this book, we see that human freedom operates inside fate, not outside it. Flannery O'Connor pushes it even further. In her story, she's got these characters that are all about Southern manners, and they're spectacularly stubborn. Read these as the forces that seem to govern their world. But grace intervenes. They have a choice. In A Good Man is Hard to Find, there's this moment of violent terror that becomes the opening for a grandmother's choice. For O'Connor, the choice is costly, because we have a collision between divine grace and human manners and stubbornness. These writers don't get rid of the paradox, they force us to inhabit it. They show us that determinism and freedom aren't abstract ideas. They're lived, agonizing realities. And that's the thing, isn't it? You can say that we have no freedom or choice, but so much of our lived experience testifies to the fact that we do. So where are we now? We've entered a new age of determinism, where everything is determined and we have no agency, because now fate is scientific. Neuroscientists say that free will is an illusion. Brain scans show decisions forming before we're conscious of them. Genetics shape temperament. Behavioral economics maps out our predictable irrationality. Evolutionary psychology explains all our desires as survival strategies. The old gods are gone. The new determinism wears lab coats. And again, literature pushes back. Modern novels will explore neuroscience without surrendering to it. Characters may be shaped by brain chemistry, but they still feel like agents. They still choose. They still matter. Even pop culture, fantasy, superhero stories, time loop narratives, these keep circling the same ancient tension. Prophecy versus choice, destiny versus agency. So have we come full circle? In some ways, yes. But something essential has changed. The Anglo-Saxons still had dignity. Even though they had no control over the wheel of fortune, the medievals still had meaning. Even the 19th century naturalists were warmed by the light of reason. The determinism we live with today leaves us with nothing positive. And yet we still push against this bleak necessity. Not just with our stories, but with our lives. We live our lives as if we were free. We still love, choose, hope, regret. Our lives tell stories about agency, even when our theories deny it. So the paradox just won't go away. In my next video, we will go one step beyond literature and look at why determinism might not actually be true. And we might have some free will after all. Thank you, and we'll see you there.